Well, good morning. I'd like to welcome you to another edition of our Anchored in the Word morning reflection. Today we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 8 again, and we're looking at verses 2 through 5 together. So if you have a Bible, I'd like to invite you to take it, and let's look together at this very important passage of Scripture. Ecclesiastes chapter 8 verse 2 says this, I counsel thee to keep the king's commandment, and that in regard of the oath of God. Be not hasty to go out of his sight. Stand not in an evil thing, for he doeth whatsoever pleaseth him. Where the word of a king is, there is power, and who may say unto him, What doest thou? Whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. Now, I want to remind you, yesterday we talked about the fact that verses 1 through 9 is really a section dealing with this issue of wisdom in relating to authority. In the context of Ecclesiastes, Solomon is talking about a person who's in a position of counseling a king. And in those days, it was very common that a king would have a number of counselors that would be in his presence. And these would be people that, when there was a decision that needed to be made, a serious matter of judgment, the king would go to those advisors and he would seek their input before he actually made the decision. And so while we think of kings being absolute authoritarians and the fact that their law stands and what they decide to do stands, we need to recognize that these individuals, especially wise kings, were people that had counselors around them. And these counselors were people that were usually older. They had a lot of experience in life. They were people who were very measured and they were very skillful. They were principled. And if a person was going to be a good king who people thrived under their leadership, then really a lot of their success as a leader and the success of the people under them was going to be connected to those who were actually counseling them and guiding them in the decision-making processes that they were involved in. So let me give you a simple summary statement of the passage in front of us. Based on the years of observation that Solomon had, he presents good counsel regarding the relationship of kings and how we're to relate to them when they're in a position of absolute authority. And so yesterday we talked about really two ideas, and I'd like us to kind of dig into the rest of this passage and kind of continue on with his thoughts. In verses 2 through 5, Solomon's going to give basically four counsels to a person that's in this position. And not only is this going to give counsel to a person in this position, but the reality is that what he's telling us is going to give us a good understanding of how to relate to other people when it comes to working through decisions. And it's not just the context of the king and those counselors that are under his authority, but the reality is if somebody's a business CEO, if a person is a pastor, if a person's an administrator in a school context or some other place, even if you're working in a business as some kind of overseer of people, the reality is that the principles that are in play in this context really would also be in play in those kinds of interactions. Even something as simple as how we run our households, the reality is that when we make decisions, we shouldn't make those decisions independent of having worked through them with the people that are under our care in some situations, or most definitely people who have experience in these areas. So let's look at those four counsels together. The first is this: we need to take time in our interaction with those who are in authority. The way that he puts it in these verses is be not hasty to go out of his sight. Now, when we read this verse, we have a question. Well, why is a person hasty to leave his sight? Is it because he's angry? Is it because he's afraid? Well, the reality is we don't exactly know why he's saying that, but let me give you a couple of reasons why I think, when I'm thinking about the context, the setting that he's addressing, he makes that statement, don't be hasty to go out of the sight of the king. I think, first of all, he's saying you need to be someone who listens. If you're going to give counsel to somebody in authority, before you give your input, you need to stop, you need to listen. Not only do you need to listen and ask a lot of questions, but the reality is you need to pay close attention to what they're saying. When you give input to somebody, you can't rush that decision. You need to hear the whole matter before you make a judgment on it. The fact is, if we don't listen to enough detail, if we don't get enough information, if we're not paying attention to the information that we're given, we may miss a very important detail, or we may not get to a very important question that really could be the difference between a good decision or a bad decision, a good approach to a matter or a bad approach to a matter. And I'll also mention this. in the process of not rushing through that matter, we need to be careful to communicate in our body language. In other words, how we listen, in our eye contact and our demeanor, that in fact we're giving tremendous weight to the matter that's being presented to us. I think that's really the sense that Solomon is saying here. If you're in the presence of the king, don't be quick to rush out. There's a lot to talk about. There are a lot of details that need to be weighed. And the king's not going to have confidence in your input unless he is sure that, in fact, you've heard the whole matter and you've thought through it and given careful attention to it and given the proper amount of weight to it. The second counsel that he gives is very interesting. Have courage when a person over you is about to make a bad decision. He puts it like this: stand not in an evil thing. You say, well, what does he mean, don't stand in an evil thing? The idea is if you're a counselor and you're in a position to give input to somebody who's about to make a decision, and you know for a fact the decision that they're about to make is not good, it's not the best, it's not the best way to go about resolving that issue. Well, the fact is, if you don't speak up and say something about it, then you've not fulfilled your duty. And what's very interesting is in chapter 8, verse 2, he says, I counsel you to regard the oath of the oath of God. And so in the context, it appears to me that this person has this moral obligation before God, this weight before God, to make sure that he speaks up when a decision is about to be made that's not appropriate or not the best. In other words, don't compromise the principle of the matter because of fear or laziness, or maybe just throwing up your hand and say, hey, he's not going to listen to me anyway. The truth is that when somebody has an idea and it's not a good idea, just because you're afraid to speak up, or just because you're too lazy to speak up, or just because you don't think he's going to listen, doesn't mean that you should just move on and forget about it. The truth is that when a person's in authority, they do need the input of other people. And so that's really what his counsel is. Remember, when someone's about to make a decision, a foolish decision, you need to speak up and not rubber stamp that decision because you simply say, he isn't going to listen to what I have to say. The truth is, he may listen to what you have to say. The truth is that that leader may not have thought of that. And when you say it, he goes, I didn't really think about that. Or, I've been struggling with that very concept that you're talking about. And the fact that you've brought it up really makes me wonder if the reason I'm struggling is because that's something that really should change the course of action that I'm looking to take. In other words, have courage. Don't stand on something that you haven't really a conviction about. The third thing we see is this. Remember, once he makes the decision, the people under him are stuck with it. This is part of what should actually sober a person that's interacting with someone in leadership, and the person in leadership actually respects your judgment. And that's very important. If the leader if you've not earned the confidence of a leader, in other words, they really don't have the conviction that you have good judgment, then your opinion probably won't matter very much unless they actually ask for it. But the point that he's trying to emphasize is, look, you have a tremendous weight of responsibility. If someone in authority trusts your judgment on a matter and you don't speak up for whatever reason, then the people under them are going to suffer because of the nature of the decision that they've made. He puts it like this: where the word of the king is, there is power. Who may say unto him, what doest thou? Basically, he's saying this: once he says this is what we're doing, the people under his authority don't have any more say. The opportunity to influence the decision is in the decision-making process, not in what follows the decision that's been made. Let that reality sober you for a bit. Maybe you're in a position where you do work with people that have tremendous authority in whatever organization that you are a part of. If you have their ear and if you have their respect and they trust you, then the fact is that you need to speak up when the time is right. Perhaps God has even raised you up and put you in that position for that very reason. And I mentioned this yesterday. We look at the fact that the king's heart is in the hands of the Lord, and as the rivers of water, he turneth it whithersoever he will. And the question is, how does God turn the king's heart? One of the ways that he does it is he brings circumstances in his sovereignty that are outside of the control of normal circumstance. That's one way. But another way, a huge way, is that God brings people into their trust who have good judgment, and God uses those people to guide the process of decision-making that individual has. And so we think of the situation of Esther, and what does Mordecai tell her? He says, perhaps God has raised you up to the kingdom for such a time as this. And he basically says, if you don't step up, Esther, and speak to the king when your people, the Jewish people, are about to be slaughtered, God's going to raise up deliverance from somewhere else. But you're in this position because you need to step up. And that's what he's saying. And I think that is the sense that Solomon is trying to sober us with in these verses. Realize the decision, though, is his to make. There are some people that frankly think that the person in leadership has the obligation to do exactly what they think should be done. And I think sometimes, as a balance to this, we need to recognize that just because we think we're right on a matter doesn't mean we're responsible to make the decision. The bottom line is, I need to speak what I believe is true, but I have to recognize if I'm a counselor rather than the king, then that means I'm not responsible to make the decision. I'm simply responsible to present my case. I'm simply responsible to state what I believe to be true. And so in the end of the matter, the king's going to make the decision he believes is best. If I've not spoken up to actually influence the decision, I've done wrong. But if I think that the king's obligated and he has to listen to what I have to say, well, in the same sense, I'm also wrong. I can't do that. And there are times, I'll just mention this, where we recognize having spoken our case and still believing that the one in authority is making a poor decision. We need to go to the Lord with that matter. We need to seek his face and say, God, you know what's right and what's wrong in this matter. I think I know, maybe I don't, but I'm appealing to you to work in this situation in a way that's bigger than me. And by the way, God is he is absolutely able, he is fully capable of doing what he needs to do when we've stated our case and really the decision lies in someone over us. The last counsel that I'll mention is this. We are to do our duty. Doing your duty will preserve the integrity of his decision making, and you'll also know the best way to go about presenting your case and executing your approach. This is really interesting verse. He says this, whoso keepeth the commandment shall feel no evil thing, and a wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. One of the things that we have to recognize when we're looking at a position of being a counselor under authority but influencing authority is that we have a responsibility to speak up. And when we do that, when we actually say what needs to be said, we're actually preserving the integrity of our own conscience. This is a very interesting word. Whoso keepeth the king's commandments shall feel no evil. That little phrase is very interesting. When you look at that word that's translated here, keep, the idea is that it can really go two ways. One is it can have the idea of obeying what the king commands us to do, and that's the way that we tend to think of it. But it can also mean to guard what the king is going to do in the sense of a watchman. And so the idea is that either in the context he's saying you need to obey the king, or he's saying you need to actually help preserve the integrity of the decisions that the king makes. And I really think the second of those two is really the sense that the word is used here. In other words, the reason there are counselors is because in the multitude of counselors there's safety. And the integrity of the king's decision making is going to come through the process of actually working through a matter with other people who have good judgment. And so basically what he's saying is by doing your duty, by speaking the truth, by actually earning the favor, and I say earning, the reality is a person in authority doesn't just give trust and doesn't just value someone's judgment without there being some demonstration of wisdom and knowledge and approach. But once someone has earned that respect and has earned that reputation in the eyes of that person in authority, the reality is that their presence helps actually preserve the integrity of the decisions being made. Very important. But then there's a second aspect to this that he says. He says, the wise man's heart discerneth both time and judgment. And the idea is one of the things that makes a person's case stick with someone in leadership is that they know how to present their case. You know, it's very interesting. There are lots of people who believe that the person over them is making poor decisions, and they get frustrated that the person that's over them doesn't listen to their input. But what they fail to realize is the reason they don't listen to their input has more to do with the way they approach the person in leadership than actually what they are presenting. In other words, when we talk about someone presenting in discernment who knows time and judgment, the idea is he knows the time to speak, and when he talks about judgment, he means the way we go about it. In other words, when a person comes to someone in leadership at the right time, in the right way, they approach the issue with soberness and grace and humility, there's a far higher likelihood that the person in authority is going to look favorably on the inputs that's been given. And by the way, one of the ways that you can tell a person has wisdom is it's not just what they want to do, but how they present what they want to do. And how they respond when somebody either listens and embraces or listens and doesn't embrace. In other words, discernment is something that really flows out of those two areas. So he's emphasizing the fact that when we approach someone in authority, timing and procedure are extremely important in the actual execution of the plan that we want to present. So when we talk about this issue of relating to authority, these four counsels, these four principles are extremely important in how we relate to those in authority. So the question is, how do we make this practical? Let me give you a couple of thoughts I jotted down today. The first is this. We need to soberly embrace the role that God has established for us. You know, for some people listening to this devotional this morning, you're in a position of authority. And if you're in a position of authority, I want to counsel you, encourage you to be a listener to the people that are around you. Even if somebody doesn't approach you the right way, let's be really careful to realize that even if someone's approach isn't the best, what they're saying might be true. And so we need to humbly listen, and we need to actually internalize, what's being presented. And that's extremely important. I also want to counsel those who are not in a position of authority to recognize you are not responsible to make the final decision, but you are responsible to speak up when the conscience is pricked and you're in the position to do so. But if you're going to do that, make sure you do it in the right way. Secondly, there's a sacred obligation to God to be principled in how we relate to people in authority. The reality is, when we speak to someone who has the authority and the responsibility to make a decision, we need to be approaching them not because of pride, I want my way, but because we feel a sacred obligation before God. It is a conscience matter that we're speaking, and essentially we're saying, I'm coming to you because I believe before God, I need to say this. I'm concerned about this. There's actually a big difference between those two. The third thing I'm going to mention is this. When we've earned the confidence of those in leadership, we need to be principled and skillful in the way we communicate with them. I think that there are a lot of people that are not in a position of authority, though one day they will. It could be their age, it could be their season of life, it could just be God's providence and how he works in their lives. They are not in a position of authority. They're not in the position to make a decision. But the reality is their input is pretty sound. It's actually good sense. It actually really can and should shape the decision making that a leader measures down. And so I want to counsel you and encourage you that you need to develop the skills that are necessary to communicate effectively so that people in authority will listen and will internalize and actually put weight on your input. The timing of a matter is extremely important. The way you approach a person is extremely important. If you'd like to influence a decision, then it's not just what you're going to say, but it's how you say it and when you say it and the circumstances related to it and the demeanor that you present when you give your case. And so I want to challenge you, let that sink in as you consider the text in front of you. And the last thing I'll mention is this. Good decision making flows from the refinement of ideas. When a person makes a choice and they've not considered other people's input, it is very likely that the decision that they're going to make is going to be extremely short-sighted. It's going to lack balance, and there's going to be a blowback from what they decide to do. On the other side, when a person considers the input and the weight of a matter as they talk about others who are very knowledgeable about the matter, who have good judgment, good sense, they understand the context very well, the decision making will be much better. As we think about the passage in front of us, I hope it'll be a challenge to you. Whether you're a leader or whether you're under authority, I hope that God will use this to challenge you this morning. Let's bow together for a word of prayer. Father, thank you for the opportunity to study your word today. I pray that you'll take the things that have been said and use them to encourage and help your people. We ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Well, it's been good to chat with you this morning. Lord willing, tomorrow we will continue our study in this section dealing with wisdom and relating to authority. It'll be the third part, and I believe it'll probably be the last part with this particular topic. Hope you have a wonderful morning. Bye now.